Welcome, everyone. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Dene, First Nations, and the Métis Nation. We would also like to thank Apple Schools for making it possible to bring in our wonderful guest today. Michael Kusugak is an award-winning author from Ramnik Inlet, Nunavut. Michael was encouraged by his boys to write his first book, A Promise is a Promise. And now he has written over a dozen children's books and won several awards, including the Vicky Metcalf Award for a body of work in children's literature. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our special guest, Michael Kusugak.
Thank you. Well, I am in Manitoba. And if I go out that way and I drive for about an hour and 10 minutes, I end up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And out here, about 2 blocks away, there's a huge lake. It's called Lake Winnipeg, and it goes way up there somewhere. But if you go that way, and you go to the very north end of Manitoba, you come to a huge bay. And that huge bay is called Hudson Bay. And I was working on a book, this book called T is for Territories. And it's an alphabet book about the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And it's an alphabet book, so I had to find things for every letter of the alphabet. And when I came to the letter H, I decided I will do Hudson Bay. I will talk about Hudson Bay. And I decided I don't need to do research on Hudson Bay because I know everything there is to know about Hudson Bay. But I decided to take a look on the internet to see if there was anything I'd missed. And sure enough, I discovered that Hudson Bay is the second biggest bay in the whole world. And here is the letter H for Hudson Bay. And I grew up on Hudson Bay. And if you go to Hudson Bay and you go to the very, very north end of Hudson Bay, you end up right on the Arctic Circle. And up there, there's a tiny little place that we call Nauyat. And we call it Nauyat because the word Nauya means seagull in my language, Inuktitut. And we call it Nauyat because there are cliffs where seagulls come to nest every summer. And when I was a little kid, that's where I lived, right up at the very north end of Hudson Bay, right on the Arctic Circle. And when I was a little kid, we used to climb up and down the cliffs and we would gather seagull eggs. We would fill up our pockets, we'd fill up our hoods, and then we'd climb up to the top of the cliffs and we would walk home and we would cook the eggs and we would eat them. And seagull eggs were the yummiest eggs I have ever had. In the winter, because Hudson Bay or Nauyat is right on the Arctic Circle, in the winter, the sun barely comes up. It almost comes up over the horizon, but then it goes back down again. In the summer, the sun hardly goes down. It just goes around and round and round and round, and it touches the horizon, but it actually doesn't go down. So in the winter, it's almost always night, and in the summer, it's almost always day. And when I was a little kid, early in the morning, my father would get up, he would go outside, he would look at the weather to see what it was going to do, and then he would take our sled and he would turn it over. We used these huge sleds that look like this. This is a model sled that I got from somebody in northern Quebec on Hudson Bay. And when I was living in Rankin Inlet, I had one of these sleds that was 20 feet long. And it has 2 runners, one on each side, and it has these cross pieces that we call naput. go from one side to the other, and they're all tied together. And they're tied together because when we're going over really rough snow, we don't want our sleds to fall apart. So we tie them all together with rope. And when I was a little kid, we didn't have plastic to use for sled runners. So we had frozen mud. And we put mud all along the bottoms of the sleds, and we would let the mud freeze, and then we'd take a plane and we'd plane it down so it was nice and smooth. And then my father would take a piece of polar bear skin, and I have a piece of polar bear skin right here. And my father would take one of these just like this, and he would pour water on it from a kettle, and then he would rub it along the bottoms of the sled runners. And he would let the water freeze. So we ended up with this nice layer of ice all along the bottoms of the sled runners. And when my father was all finished icing the sled, he would roll it back up. He would move it back and forth to make sure it was nice and smooth. And then we would take all our stuff from outside our igloo or from inside our igloo, and we would put them on the sled. We would roll them up in huge skins and tie them all down. And then we would hitch our dogs to our sled, and we would go traveling all day long. You know, where we come from, there are no trees. There is not one single tree that grows where we come from. And because we have no trees to get in the way, we hitch our dogs all on separate lines. So every dog has his very own line. We might have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 dogs. They all have their own lines. The dogs that like to run get the longest lines, and the lazy ones get the short ones. And when we were going along, the dogs would jump over each other, over and over and over and over, until their lines were so tangled that they couldn't run anymore. We would stop. My father would take all the lines off the dogs. He would untangle them all. My mother would get us some lunch, and after lunch, we would go traveling all the rest of the day. And sometimes it gets a little cool. The coldest day I remember was -52. And if you're going to be outside all day long in really cold weather, you have to wear some really, really warm clothes. So we wore the warmest clothing in the world. I had a caribou skin coat. I have some caribou skin here. And I had a coat made out of this skin, and it had the fur on the inside. So I had caribou fur right up against my skin. And when I was outside, I would wear another coat made out of caribou skin that would have the fur on the outside. And so when I was a little kid, I spent a lot of time looking kind of like, you know how when you're little and your mom gets cold and she puts layers and layers and layers of clothing on you and you can hardly move. And even then, when I was sitting on a sled for a long time, just bouncing up and down, after a while, I would start to get cold. And when I got cold, I would jump off the sled. I would run along beside the sled until I got all warmed up. Then I would sit back down again. And sometimes I didn't even have to jump off because we would hit a bump and I would fall off. And then I'd have to run to catch up. So we traveled like that all day long. And at night, when we stopped, my father would build an igloo. And when the igloo was all ready, we'd go inside, we'd bring all our stuff inside. My mother and my grandmother would light a big stone seal oil lamp. And these things are like this. This is the little one that we got from somebody, a friend of ours in Rankin Inlet. And it is made out of soapstone, so it's really heavy. And it has this depression on the top where you put the seal oil and you put a wick all along the front. And when you light it, it looks like a whole bunch of candles lit all along the front. And my mother and my grandmother would light one of these, but the ones that we had were really big like this. So they were really, really heavy. And they would light one and they would start to cook us something to eat. they would heat up the inside of the igloo a little bit because sometimes it was really quite cold. And then they would make up a bed, a nice big bed with lots of warm furs. And every night when I was all finished eating, I would go to bed. And when I went to bed, I would say to my grandmother, "Ananatiak, unikakto alawit." And my grandmother would say, "Unikakto sa kangin nama. Ananatiak, unikakto alawit. Unikakto sa kangin nama. Grandmother, please tell me a story." But I have no story to tell. "Grandmother, please tell me a story." But I have no story to tell. And after I asked her many, many times, she would finally say, "Okay, settle down and I'll tell you a story." And my grandmother told me some of the most wonderful stories I have ever heard. My most favorite story when I was a little kid was the one that goes, "Ananatyari ko kimaktawyuk, kopanawdugulong migui galayak tawyuk, palatatatyuk." You like that story? It's a story about a little kid and her grandmother. And they got left behind all by themselves in their igloo. And then a little bird came, a little white bird, a snow bunting. It broke the window. It said, "Palatatatyuk," and flew away. And that was the story. And I really loved that story. And I would ask my grandmother to tell it to me over and over and over until she got tired of it. And then I would have to ask her again, "Ananatiak unikakto alawit." And she would say, "But I have no story to tell." But of course, my grandmother always had lots and lots of stories to tell. Well, my people are Inuit. And Inuit live all across the north. Way over on the other side of the world, there's a country called Russia. And on the north end of Russia, there's a place called Siberia. And Inuit live there. And across the Bering Strait in a place called Alaska, there are more Inuit. And all across northern Canada, we have Inuit, and even including northern Quebec and Labrador. And there are also Inuit in Greenland. And we all speak the same language. The language is called Inuktitut, which means like the Inuit. And we have many different dialects, but we can understand each other pretty well. So I can talk to people from Alaska in my language, and I can talk to people from Greenland. And we dress the same way. We wear a lot of caribou skin clothing in the middle of winter. And we eat the same kinds of foods, and we tell the same stories. And these stories are really, really, really old. They're hundreds, maybe thousands of years old. The most famous person in our stories is a man called Kivio. My grandmother said Kivio was born a long, 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 long time ago, so long ago that he was the very first person on earth. I used to have a little joke with my grandmother. I would say, "Grandmother, if Kivio was the first person, how come he had a mother?" And my grandmother would say, "Don't argue with old people." But my grandmother was very kind and gentle, and I wasn't very scared of her, so I would tease her, "Grandmother, you know he had a mother. How could he be the first person?" Well, my grandmother and all the old people say Kivio is still alive, but he is so old, his body is turning to stone. And one day I was way, way, way up north in a place called Resolute Bay. And when I was there, I met an old, old woman. And this old woman invited me to her house for some tea. And we were sitting at her kitchen table drinking our tea. And then I said, "Old woman, have you ever heard of Kivio? And she said, yeah. She said, Kivio is so old. His forehead is all black and it's really hard. His cheeks are all black and they're really hard. His chin is all black and they're really hard because he's turning to stone. And the old people say, someday when Kivio's heart turns completely to stone and stops, that will be the end of the universe. And I don't think that's going to happen for a long time. I think Kivio's heart is going to keep beating because I like to tell stories about him. And I think when I tell stories about Kivio, it makes him happy. And as long as he's happy, his heart keeps going. And as long as his heart keeps going, we will have a universe. So I'd like to tell you a little story. A long, 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 long time ago, there was a little boy. And this little boy loved to go out to play. But there were mean boys who lived in this camp. They would run after him. They would fight him. They would make him cry. They would rip up all his clothes. And the poor boy would go home to his grandmother because he was an orphan. He had no mother and no father. So he lived with his grandmother. And his poor old grandmother would take her needle and thread and she would sew his clothes all back together again. And the little boy would put on his clothes. He would go off to play. The mean boys would run after him. They would fight him. They would make him cry. They would rip up all his clothes. And his poor old grandmother had to sew them all back together again. One day, when the little boy came home, there was a little seal that somebody had caught for them, and it was lying on the floor. His grandmother said, I would like you to skin that seal. So the little boy took a knife. He started to skin the seal. His grandmother said, be careful, don't put any holes in the skin. So very, very carefully, the little boy skinned the seal. And when he was all finished, his grandmother said, I would like you to take the sealskin and pull it over your head, and I would like you to put your head in that pail of water. There was a great big pail of water on the floor. So the little boy took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he stuck his head into this pail of water. He kept his head underwater as long as he could, and when his lungs hurt, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. So he took another deep breath and he stuck his head back into this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going like this. You know what seals look like? They look like this. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could. And when he was just about to drown, he lifted his head and he went, and his grandmother said, do it again. So he took another deep breath and he stuck his head back into this pail of water. And he kept his head underwater as long as he could, going. And when he was just about to drown, he lifted his head and he went. And his grandmother said, do it again. Every time he lifted his head, his grandmother would say, do it again. He would take a deep breath and he would stick his head back into this pail of water. And after a while, he could keep his head underwater for a long, 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 long time. And there was an old man who lived way up north in a place called Kusugak. He told me he would keep his head underwater so long, he would move the sun. Have you ever tried to hold your breath until the sun moves? It takes a long time. And finally, his grandmother was satisfied that he could keep his head underwater long enough. She said, I would like you to go down to the beach. And when you're walking to the beach, make sure nobody sees you. And when you get to the water's edge, I would like you to take the sealskin and pull it over your head and jump into the water and go for a swim and come up right in front of all your mean friends who are playing on the beach. And sure enough, all the mean boys were playing on the beach. You know, when I was a little kid, we used to play on the beach. We would make a sack out of some kind of cloth, and and we would fill it full of sand, and then we'd sew it all together, and then we'd play a game of catch down on the beach, and we call it Kayak. So that's what those mean boys were doing. They were playing catch with the sack down on the beach, and the little boy took the sealskin. He walked down to the beach. He made sure nobody saw him. And when he got to the water's edge, he took the sealskin, he pulled it over his head so that it fit nicely, and he looked like a little seal. And then he took a deep breath, and he jumped into the water. He went for a swim underwater, and he came up right in front of all the mean boys who were playing on the beach. They looked at him, and they said, "Hey, there's a little seal." They thought he was a little seal, and they all ran up. They grabbed their kayaks. You know, their long, skinny skin boats. I have one here. It's we call it a kayak, but in English they're called kayaks. And we invented these things a long, long time ago. And this is a frame. This is exactly the way they're built, and they're all tied together like our sleds. And that is because when you go over really rough water, your kayak will not fall apart. And we cover them with sealskin. And I have a garage over there. And in my garage, I have one of these that is 16 feet long. And so those mean boys took their kayaks and they put them in the water, and they hopped in. They took their long paddles and they started to paddle following the little seal. The little seal would go down underwater and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And then he would go down and he would swim a little bit farther out, and then he would come up again. And the mean boys who fought him and made him cry and ripped all his clothes, they were paddling their kayaks following along behind him. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And after a while, they were way out at sea. And when they were way out at sea, when the little seal came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Ano ka na? Ano ka Kylie? Unga, unga." And then he'd go down again, and he would swim a little bit farther out. And when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Ano ka na? Ano ka Kylie? Unga, unga." And then he'd go down again, and he would swim a little bit farther out. And when he came up, he would lift up his arm and his leg, and he would sing, "Where is my wind? I want my wind." And he would make a crying sound like a little baby. Well, well. People say the weather that was on the day you were born is your very own weather. And that is why, if you were born on a sunny day, usually the sun shines on your birthday. If you were born on a rainy day, usually it rains on your birthday. And this little boy was born on a very, very windy day. And he was calling the weather that was on the day he was born. "Where is my wind? I want my wind." And he made a crying sound like a little baby. Wah, wah. Just like the day he was born. The wind heard him, and it started to come. It got windier and windier and windier, and before long there were huge waves in the water. And the kayaks with all the mean boys were going up and down in the big waves. And every now and then a giant wave would come and it would flip the kayaks over. And before long, there was only one person left. That person was Kivio. Now, Kiviok was very good with his kayak. He paddled his kayak on and on, going up and down in the big waves. And when a giant wave came and flipped his kayak over, he would roll it back up. He was really, really good with his kayak. And he kept on going. No matter how cold and wet and tired he got, he never gave up. He paddled his kayak on in the big storm, and every time it flipped over, he would roll it back up. And finally, after a long time, the wind stopped and the sea became really, really still again. And Kiviok was so tired, he put his paddle on his lap, he put his head on his chest, and he fell asleep. He slept for a long time, and when he woke up, he sat up in his kayak, he stretched, he looked around, he looked all around, but there was nothing but water. He was way out in the middle of the ocean. And because he was way out in the middle of the ocean, he couldn't see any land anywhere. And because he couldn't see land, he didn't know which way to go. And while he was sitting there, he started to think about some strange and wonderful things. One of the things he thought about was this little feather he had on the back of his coat. You see, ever since he was a tiny little boy, his mother. See, I told you he had a mother. I told my grandmother he had a mother. His mother always sewed a little feather on the back of his coat. It was a feather from a little bird called a Kusugak. And a Kusugak is a little brown bird that swims in tiny ponds. And while it's swimming, it goes around in circles, around and round and round and round. And while it's going around in circles, it goes like this. They're funny little birds, and I love to watch them. And he had this little feather on the back of his coat. And he always wondered what it was for. And while he was sitting there, a little bird came. A little white bird, a snow bunting. You know, like the little bird that broke the window. It landed on his kayak. It looked at Kiviok and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So he started to follow the little bird. And he paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon like a little piece of thread. And he thought it was land. So he paddled his kayak toward it. But after a while, it disappeared, and Kiviok said, "It's disappeared again. It must have been a big wave." And the little bird looked at him again and said, "Do you know which way to go?" And Kiviok said, "No, I don't know which way to go because there's nothing but water." And the little bird said, "Well, follow me." So he started to follow the little bird again, and he paddled his kayak on, and after a long time, he saw this really thin line on the horizon like a little piece of thread, and he thought it was land. So he paddled his kayak toward it, and this time it did not disappear. It got thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker, and Kiviok landed his kayak way over on the other side of the ocean in this strange place. And when I was a little boy, and my grandmother told me that story, for the longest time, I didn't know the story had an ending because I always fell asleep. You like that story? Well, that is just the beginning of the story. When Kiviok ended up on the other side of the ocean, the first things he came across were giant spiders. It was a very strange place, and these giant spiders started to chase him, and he had to run away. And then he found a strange igloo. It had no top. And when he walked up to it and looked inside, there was a giant bumblebee sitting on a bed. And it was cooking some strange stuff in a cooking pot. And Kiviok had all these adventures with these strange creatures. And every time he got into trouble, a little bird would come. a little white bird. You know that little bird he had in the back of his coat, the brown one? That was his magic bird. His magic bird would send him a little white bird, and the little bird would help him. And Kivio had all these adventures, and he got homesick. So he started traveling, trying to find his way home. And while Kivio was trying to find his way home, he traveled through every part of the north. So there are stories about him everywhere. If you go to Siberia, you can hear stories about Kivio. If you go to Alaska, you can hear stories about Kivio. We have Kivio stories all across northern Canada, and there are Kivio stories in Greenland too. And those are the stories that I heard when I was a little boy. When I was 6 years old, an airplane came. And this airplane took a bunch of us kids down to a place called Chesterfield in that to go to school. We had to live with a whole bunch of nuns and priests, and we had to go to school for the whole school year. It was one of those infamous residential schools. But I was only 6 years old. I missed my mother. I missed my father. I missed all my brothers and sisters. So I used to sit in the back of the class on the floor, and I would play with big wooden blocks, and I would cry and cry and cry. And that's all I remember about my first year of school. In the spring, the airplane came again. It took us back to Nauyat or Repulse Bay, and we had a wonderful summer. And in the fall, the airplane came again. It was going to take us back to school, but I really didn't want to go. So I ran away. I hid in the hills until I saw the airplane leave. After the airplane left, I went home and I skipped school for a whole year. But eventually I had to go back to school because I had a little brother. His name was Josie, and he turned 6, and they were hauling him away to school. So I decided I'd better go with them. And the second time I went away to school, I had a much better time because I had my little brother. And eventually I grew up. And when I grew up, I got married, and then I had a boy, and then I had another boy, and another boy, and another boy. And when I only had 3 boys, I would put them to bed at night. And when I put my boys to bed, they would say, "Dad, can you read us a book?" They would get a book and I would read to them. But that was 35 years ago. And 35 years ago, there were hardly any books for kids in Canada. And there were no books for kids up north, for Inuit kids. So I got really, really tired of reading all those books. And one night I said to my boys, "I'm not going to read you these books anymore. I'm just going to tell you a story." So I told my boys a story. When I was a little kid, growing up in Nauyat, we used to go fishing down on the sea ice, and we would find big cracks in the ice, and we would take our fish hooks and we put them down the hole and we would fish. And sometimes we caught these nice cod. We call them, what do we call them? We call them ugak. And then we caught tekaluit, which are really big, well, this big. And they're called Arctic char. And sometimes we caught these ugly fish, and they grow to be about this big, and they have a tiny little tail and a great big head. And their heads are kind of flat, and they have spikes sticking out of the tops of their heads, and they have a great big mouth. And when we caught one, we would pull it up out of the water, and it would be hanging there at the end of our fishing line, and we would open its mouth to take the hook out, and sometimes there was another fish in its mouth. And so we'd take the hook out and we'd put them back in the water, and we would watch them swim all the way back down to the bottom of the sea. And one night we were all fishing down on the sea ice when all of a sudden all these bubbles started to come up out of the water, and somebody yelled, and we got scared. We dropped everything, and we ran and ran and ran all the way back to the land. And when we got there, we stood on the rocks. And we waited for the Kadlupidluit to come up out of the water because my mother used to tell us about these creatures that live under the sea ice. And she called them Kadlupidluit. And she said, Kadlupidluit are old women who live under the ice, and they have this big coat for carrying babies. We call them amouts. And I have my little friend here who's got an amout. And this is a baby carrying coat. And we call it an amout. And if you look in the back, there's a big hood that goes over everybody here. And this pouch here is the amout part where you carry the baby. And if you open the hood, and you can see the little baby here. Here's the little baby, and you can pull it out. And this baby is in a little bag, a bunting bag, and you can take it out of, and there's the baby. And you can hold the baby, and you can put it back in the bunting bag. And then you can put it back in the back of the amout here. And so, and it's very nice and snug there. And so these old women who live under the sea ice, they wear amouts like this, only they're made of loon skins. And my mother said, they don't have any kids of their own. So if you go down to the sea ice by yourself, they will say, aha, there's a little boy with no mother and no father. They will take you, they'll put you on their backs, they'll take you down under the sea ice, and they'll never bring you back. So we were always scared of these creatures. And one night I told my boys a story about them, and they said, Dad, why don't you write it down? So I wrote it down. And when I was all finished writing it, I read it to them, and my boy said, Dad, it's really scary. Why don't you have it made into a book? So I got together with a friend of mine. I have a very good friend who lives in Ontario, and his name is Robert Munch. And Robert Munch and I got together, and we rewrote that story over and over and over. And he thought it was too scary too. So when he rewrote it, he made it less scary. And when I got it back, I rewrote the whole thing and I made it scarier. And then he got it back and he made it less scary and I made it scarier. And one day I called him on the phone and I said, Bob, it's supposed to be a scary story, okay? It's supposed to keep my boys from going down to the sea ice in the springtime when it's very dangerous for little kids to be jumping from ice floe to ice floe. And he said, oh, okay. So when we were happy with it, we had it made into a book. And the book is called A Promise is a Promise. So this was the very first book I wrote. And if you look here, it says, this sticker here says, Anniversary Edition 30 years. So it turned 30 years old, but that was 3 years ago. So it is now 33 years old, this book. And I wrote another one, and this one is in my language, Inuktitut. It's all written in syllabics, and that's the way we write. And then we had one made in French. This is the French version. And I found another one. And this one is written in a language called Mi'kmaq, which is the language of people who live in Nova Scotia. And they write like this. And then I found another one. And this one is in Greenlandic Inuktitut. And this is the way people in Greenland write. Nireusutavuk. Well, it has been in a movie. There's a play, baseball, Promise is a Promise. And there's a puppet show that you can see if you go to Ottawa. And when I was finished writing that book, I wrote another book, and the book is called Baseball Bats for Christmas. And this is the true story. It's a story about me and my friends. And the very first trees we ever saw. You remember I said we come from a place where there are no trees. And when I was 7 years old, an airplane, French, and we had one made in Japanese. And then I wrote a whole bunch of other books. You know, before we got hit with COVID-19, we used to travel all over the world. And I would tell stories. And one day we were in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I was telling stories at the Winnipeg Children's Festival. And when I was all finished, they gave me a check for $1,000. And I got my check, and I was standing on the stage when my wife came over and she said, "Can I have your check?" I said, "Okay." And I gave her my check, and I said, "What are you going to do with all that money?" She said, "I'm going to buy you a dog." And sure enough, the very next day, this little puppy arrived. It came from a place called Red Deer, Alberta. And when I got my little puppy, I called the kennels in Red Deer and I said, "What do you call my puppy?" They said, "Oh, we really don't have a name for her. We just call her U2. I said, "U2 like the rock band U2? And they said, "No, just U2. And I said, "Why do you call my dog U2? They said, "It's because she never listens." And sure enough, I got this little puppy who never listens. She just sat there. And one day I was looking at her trying to figure out what she was doing. And then I got it. You know what she likes to do? Daydream. You see, when she was a tiny, tiny puppy, her mother used to tell her stories. And what do dogs tell stories about? Other dogs, of course. Her mother told her stories about dogs from all around the world. And my little puppy would sit there and she would think, when I grow up, I'm going to be a great big St. Bernard dog. And she was going to go rescue skiers in the Alps, in the big mountains when they get caught in avalanches. And then she thought, oh, maybe not. When I grow up, I'm going to be a golden retriever, because she loves to run and splash in the water, and she was going to fetch ducks for duck hunters. And then she thought, oh, maybe not. When I grow up, I'm going to be a great big sled dog. And sure enough, she came to live with me way up north in a place called Rankin Inlet. And when I got her, I put her on the leash and we went for a walk, and she pulled and pulled and pulled. She was practicing to be a sled dog. And one day we took her over to my mother's house and she was running around. And my mother said, oh, what a cute puppy. What do you call her? I said, Mom, we really don't have a name for her. We just call her U2. And my mother said, what does that mean? Because my mother didn't speak any English. And I said, Mom, it means Igloo. And my mother said, oh, that's a nice name. Why don't you call her Igloo? So then I had a little puppy whose name was Igloo, and it means U2. And in the fall, it started to snow. It got colder and colder and colder, and she still had to go outside to pee and anak. And when she went outside to pee and anak, she discovered the snow was really cold, and she would lift up her paws one after the other, trying not to keep them on the snow for too long because her paws were getting cold. And one day she was trying to lift up all her paws all at the same time when she fell over. And I felt so sorry for my little puppy who had cold feet. So I went out and I bought her little booties. And after that, every time my little puppy wanted to go outside to pee and anak in the winter, she would jump up on the couch, she would put up her little paws, and I would put her little boots on, and we would go outside. One day, we went for a walk. when she saw them. Real sled dogs. They were pulling a huge sled. There was a man sitting on a sled. He was saying, "Away, oi, hot, 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 hot." And the lead dog, the biggest dog of them all, said, "Right, right, left, left, carefully now, slowly now." And they pulled, and finally they came to this long chain on the ground. Their master took them off their harnesses and tied them up to the long chain. And then he opened up a great big box. And inside the box, there were huge chunks of frozen fish. He picked them up. He threw them at the dogs. And the dogs all started going, rah, 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 rah. They were trying to bite each other. They were trying to fight each other. And they were gulping down these huge chunks of frozen fish without hardly chewing on them at all. And my little puppy, who wanted so much to be a great big sled dog, she pulled me over to the biggest one of them all, the big gray lead dog. The big dog just looked at her and said, "Growl! You stay away from my food or I'll eat you up, your little booties and all." And my poor little puppy, she got so scared, she went yelp, 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 yelp all the way home. And behind her, she could hear the big dogs. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were really mean. And that night, after we had supper, I sat down on the couch. I turned the TV on, and my little puppy jumped up on the back of the couch where she likes to lie and watch TV. And then we started to watch her favorite movie. There was this beautiful girl walking along a yellow brick road, and she sang so beautifully, "Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true." And right then and there, my little puppy decided, I'm not going to be a sled dog after all. I'm going to be a movie star. You know why? Because that girl in that movie has a little puppy that looked exactly like my little puppy. And that story is called The Littlest Sled Dog. And I wrote it down, and here it is, The Littlest Sled Dog. And if you find this book and you look on the very last page of the book, on the very last page, there's a picture. And that is my little dog, Igloos. Well, you know, sometimes the wind blows, and when the wind blows, there is so much snow flying around that you can't see anything at all. And if you go for a walk, you get lost right away. So when I was a little kid, sometimes we had to sit in our igloos for a long, 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 long time. And it got to be really, really boring because we had no televisions, we had no radios, we had no videos, we had no video games. We didn't even have any books because there were no books written in my language, and we didn't speak any English at all. And I would sit there and I would say to my grandmother, "Jack, I am so bored." And my grandmother would say, "Why don't we play a game?" And I'd say, "But grandmother, we don't have any toys." And my grandmother said, "But we have the best toy in the world." And she would reach into her pocket and she would take out a piece of string. And I'd say, "But grandmother, that's not a toy, that's just a piece of string." And my grandmother said, "But this is very special string. This is magic string. This is string that does not like to be tied to your fingers. It always comes off." And she would tie up her fingers like this. And sure enough, her string always came off. And she would say, "Even if you tie up your fingers really good and tight, this string still does not like to be tied to your fingers. it always comes off. And she would tie up her fingers really good and tight like this. And sure enough, her string always came off. And she would say, even if you tie up your fingers any old way, just tie them up any old way like this string still does not like to be tied to your fingers. It always comes off. So we played with the string for a long time, and before we knew it, the wind was all gone, and we could go outside to play again. We played a game called Cat's Cradle, and you play Cat's Cradle with two people. And you know, this is, I think, the most amazing game in the world, because I played it with people all over the world. About 10 years ago, we went to India, and I played the game with people in India. And then we went to China, and I played the game with people in China. And then we went to Singapore and Korea, and I played the game with people over there. And then I played it with people in Germany. I played it with people in Hawaii and Mexico and all over North America. People all over the world know how to play Cat's Cradle. But we didn't call it Cat's Cradle because we didn't have cats, which was really quite all right, because I'm allergic to cats anyway. And we learned how to make some string figures. And my grandmother said, if you learn how to make these string figures, you have to rub the string on your forehead like this so that you'll remember how to do it the next time. And, you know, I think I have the most amazing job in the world, because I get to travel all over the world and tell stories to people all over the world. And one day I was showing this to a bunch of tiny little kids, and one little boy looked at it and he said, I know what that is. I know what that is. I said, what? He said, it's a butterfly with underwear. But that's not underwear, that's a kayak. You know, those long skinny skin boats. This is the front part of the boat. This is the stern, the back part, and this round hole in the middle here is where you sit and you paddle your boat along the water like this, going up and down on the waves. Except the mean boys were going. And what do you do when you're in a kayak? Go and look at whales. Let's see if we can find a whale in our kayak. I have to rub this on my forehead lots and lots of times because it's really, really hard to do. But we find a whale. And there's the whale. This is the head of the whale. These are the flippers up here and down here. The body is here in the middle. The tail is over at this end. And the whale swims like this. Now, let me tell you a little story about this whale. You know, this whale is not very smart. And one day it decided to show off. So it swims really, really, really fast. It swims so fast it goes zooming right up on the beach and it can't get back in the water. And you know what happens to a whale that can't get back in the water? And you know what really, really loves dead whales? Are seagulls. And here comes a seagull. This is the head of the seagull up on the top. This is the beak. The neck is here, the body is here in the middle. The tail is over at this end and the legs are down there at the bottom. You see the seagull standing there? Now the seagull comes along, it eats up the flippers of the dead whale. It eats a lot of the skin, which is called makdak, because I think seagulls are just about the only animal in the world who love makdak more than me. So the seagull comes along, it eats up all the the fins and everything. And then along comes a polar bear, and here comes a polar bear. There is the polar bear. This is the head of the polar bear here. This is the nose. And down here are the legs, the front legs of the polar bear. This is the back, and the back legs are over here. Now, this polar bear is pretty skinny. That's because it's really, really hungry. And this polar bear comes along and it eats up all the meat from the dead whale. And then along comes a little fox, because that's what foxes like to do. They follow polar bears around to see if the polar bears left anything behind for them to eat. So along comes the little fox, and here comes the little fox. And there is the little fox. Now this little fox comes, it cleans up all the bones. It nibbles on all the bones, and then it walks away. You want to see the little fox walk? Okay, let's see if we can make the little fox walk. Here we go.
Hi, Michael. We just have a few more minutes. I was wondering if we could do some questions.
And those are all the stories I have for you for today.
So I did have a lot of comments come in saying that they're really enjoying listening to you and your stories, and it's very entertaining.
Thank you.
So one of the questions was, how often did you move into different igloos?
Well, it depends. If we are moving all the time, then we moved into a different igloo every day. My father would build a new igloo, and sometimes when we came across an igloo that we had abandoned before, we just fix it up and move back in. But sometimes, if the hunting was really good or fishing was really good, then we would stay in the igloo for a week, 2 weeks, and then we go and find and build another igloo somewhere.
Where did you get the wood to make the kayak?
Driftwood mostly. And because we didn't have any wood, sometimes we have to walk a long way to get some wood, to the tree line. But most times we found driftwood, and if we didn't have enough wood for some parts, we just make it out of bone, and it's all tied together. So it was very flexible, and that's why they're made this way, because they use very little wood. So you just make the frame, and they're thin pieces, long, thin pieces. And sometimes if the pieces were too short, you would just splice them. So, to make a long piece of wood, you put two pieces together like this and tie them, and that's the way they're made.
Did you have any vegetable growing?
No.
Rankin Inlet?
No, we ate a few vegetables in the summer, but we didn't eat any vegetables at all in the winter. But what we did, you remember, a long time ago, our people were called Eskimos by the Cree. Eskimo is a Cree word, and so the Cree people called us Eskimos, and it means people who eat raw meat. And what happens when you eat raw meat is that you eat the vegetables or the vitamins that are in the meat. And muktaf, the skin of the whale, has probably more vitamin C than there is in an orange. So we got a lot of our vegetables or our vitamins through eating the meat raw, because if you cook it, you cook all the vitamins away. So, and that is why, all these explorers that came in the 1800s, a lot of them died from something called scurvy, because they didn't get enough vegetables or enough vitamins. But we never ever got scurvy because we ate a lot of our food raw.
How long were you at a residential school?
For about 6 years, I think. First time I went, it was 1954. I was 6 years old, and the last time was when I was 12 in 1960. And then we moved to Rankin Inlet, and there was a federal day school in Rankin Inlet that I went to for a couple of years. And then I went to another school in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and then Churchill, and I graduated from high school in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
All over.
Yeah.
What is your favorite book that you didn't write?
That I didn't write?
I think they were asking what your favorite book is.
Well, I think my most favorite book is Les Miserables, like, by Victor Hugo. It's a really thick book. It's all in French, but you can find translations, and it's absolutely wonderful because it's written like a storyteller would write it. But my second most favorite book probably is That's All Poetry by Chaucer. And maybe my third one would be A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Same guy who wrote, what is it, Christmas Story? Yeah. Yeah. A Christmas Carol.
So do you like to cook? What wonderful things do you eat up north?
Well, we eat a lot of meat. We eat, caribou meat, because there are caribou all across the north, and we eat. We don't eat much seal anymore, but we used to eat a lot of seal meat. But we have some of the nicest fish in the world. They're called Arctic char, and we eat whale, like the skin of the whale. The muktak is my favorite food because I grew up with it in Nauyat. There are lots of whales in Nauyat. There still are lots of whales that go up to Nauyat every summer. So.
I just have a couple more. So it sounds like you do a lot of traveling during non-COVID times to share your stories. How do you stay active and healthy?
I like to go fishing, and I walk a lot. And I have a kayak that I like to paddle, and so, I keep busy all the time. I like to build things too. So I spend a lot of time building. I built a kayak. And when I'm up north, I build sleds and I make snow knives. And right now I'm building an igloo that's made out of plywood. Someday, when I get it done, we'll show you what a plywood igloo looks like.
And I have a couple similar questions, just some students asking how to get started writing and how to get started with storytelling.
Well, I go and visit your grandparents and get them to tell you stories and tell them, that you want to hear stories from a long time ago, and they're absolutely wonderful. And grandparents like to be visited, and they like to tell stories, because that's what we do. But these stories, like the Kiviok stories, are really, really, really old. They're thousands of years old. And but to get started in writing, I have to think of something that I wanted to share with my boys when they were little. And so I decided I'd share them, this creature that, our parents used to tell us about that lives under the sea ice, the Kadlupidluit. And so I wrote that, and then I wrote another book. The book is called Hide and Sneak. This one. And then I wrote a book called Northern Lights, The Soccer Tales. All the things that you learn, you know, from your culture when you're growing up, you can write them down, and what you do, what you have to do is you have to write them down, and then you have to rewrite them and rewrite them and rewrite them, because stories like the Kayak stories have been told so many times over these thousands of years that every time somebody tells a story, it gets better and better and better and better until today they're practically perfect stories. You know, so you have to learn how to tell the stories and have fun. That's the major thing about telling stories to other people, is that you have to enjoy doing it and talking to people.
Thank you so much. Like I said, so many wonderful comments saying that they love listening to you and they love the stories. It was really engaging and enjoying. They really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.